All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to our last technology session at the IAPh Symposium of the International Association of Women Philosophers in virtual Paderborn. I'm happy that our first speaker, Katja Cicigoj, is already there. And I am happy to say that she will speak to us now about reproduction between biology, technology, and social relations in Beauvoir and Firestone. And she is at the Paderborn University, and she's doing normally work on contemporary European philosophy, as she says, but now, maybe this is also contemporary. That's right. So, Katja, do you want to share the screen and with something?
No, actually, I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will just present.
All right, that's fine. So I would say the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so in my doctoral thesis, I'm working on Beauvoir, and I have done also some work on Firestone, and I will now present mainly on Firestone's work and how that connects to Beauvoir as well. So yes, my talk today is situated somewhere between, let's say, a kind of history of feminist thought and a feminist philosophy of technology. And as I said, I will focus upon Shulamit Firestone and her understanding of technology, especially reproductive technologies and their potential role in undoing women's, today we could say also more inclusively gendered or more specifically reproductive oppression. I will argue that Firestone in the Dialectic of Sex, which was published in 1969, also by drawing on Beauvoir, articulates an understanding of human biological reproduction, technology, and social relations that remains relevant for understanding biological reproduction as an ongoing site of oppression today, from obstetric violence to exploitation of gestational labor, lack of reproductive choice and support, and so on. And that without seeing biological reproduction as determining this oppression forever. I argue that rereading Firestone today may thus indicate a way beyond a radical social constructivism, which, in glossing over the needs and vulnerabilities of human bodies, I believe may fall short of explaining the ongoingness of reproductive oppression. But she also indicates a way beyond, let's say, the vitalist materialism of new materialist and post-humanist philosophies, which I think overly optimistically confide in the self-formative and self-transformative capacities of nature and matter. Before proceeding to the main argument, I will just say a little bit about this book, because I think it's maybe less well known for some people. Let's say, with some exceptions, of course, it has not received so much attention in feminist scholarship until quite recently. And the notable exception is, of course, the collection of essays, The Further Adventures of the Dialectic of Sex, edited by Mandy Merck and Stella Sanford and out in 2010. And recently, the work of xenofeminists Helen Hester, but also Sophie Lewis in Full Surrogacy Now, and a book by Victoria Margret in the Neglected or Misunderstood series. So in this work, The Dialectic of Sex, Firestone attempts to theoretically ground women's liberation, especially radical feminism. And to this aim, she deploys a very singular interpretation and, in a way, subversion of Engels' historical materialism, of some psychoanalytic theories, and I think more accurate take on the anti-naturalism of Simone de Beauvoir. to whom the book is also dedicated. Firestone argues that some dependencies and inequalities already present in the specificities of human biological reproduction are used and deployed to ground the oppression of those with the perceived capacity for birthing, which throughout history have been mostly women, but also of children. And that these inequalities would be especially exacerbated in the modern nuclear patriarchal family. In an analogy with the Marxian theory of proletarian revolution, Firestone argues that women, as historically the main reproductive laborers, should, I quote, take control of the means of reproduction, unquote, and with the help of technology, effect a thorough societal transformation that would secure the maximum autonomy of all, while also providing arrangements for everyone's caring, social, emotional, and cooperative needs. In such a society, not only would children be freer and more capable of autonomous existence much sooner than we now allow for, and of course, I think I agree with many scholars that probably Firestone overestimates the autonomy capacity of children and underestimates the need of care. But so importantly, also for a feminist theory, Firestone argues that in such a society, I quote, genital differences between the sexes would no longer matter culturally, unquote. When conceptualizing the means for achieving such a society, Firestone puts forth some proposals that I think have turned out to be quite timely lately. So one proposal is that all people of all generations would live in elective households, as she calls them, which wouldn't, so people that would not necessarily be tied by blood. And this would in a way also undo the dependencies and possessiveness of the current nuclear family model. I think here Firestone articulates a very early consideration of intergenerational justice and care, but also somehow anticipates the discussions about non-biological kinships, queer kinship, and so on. This for Firestone would also necessitate urbanistic reorganization. People would live in campus-like towns with common kitchens, laundries, and so on, which would enable the collectivization and automation of socially reproductive labor. And this would be facilitated by what she calls cybernation, which includes also large information centers or computer libraries, where people would in a way gain education according to their own needs, their own pace and interests, which would also controversially somehow supplant public schooling for her. This all would be made possible by the full or as much as possible automation of both productive and reproductive labor. And through that, of course, wages would somehow, or the wage model of labor would be undone. Instead of it, people of all ages would receive an equal and steady basic income, which is a very early articulation of the idea of the universal basic income. But importantly for Firestone, this would not only undo, let's say, wage work, but also help secure women's and children's economic independence. And given the ecological disaster that she somehow detects being ongoing already in '69, we would also need to establish a new ecological balance, as she calls it, not by returning to nature, but by finding new technological solutions that would help us build a more sustainable relationship with the environment. She also interestingly makes a quite early case for transdisciplinarity, I think in the chapter, The Dialectics of Cultural History, where she argues for overcoming the divide between arts and humanities on the one hand and the sciences. But for what remains of this talk, I want to focus upon Firestone's most controversial proposal. And this is her proposal for let's say, introducing the possibility of ectogenesis or ex utero gestation of human fetuses. And through this idea, I would like to rethink her specific anti-naturalism and how it can help us conceptualize reproductive oppression. This proposal by Firestone has mostly been seen as an excess of radical feminism. When it has been given serious consideration, it was mostly seen as a naive techno-fix to what is actually a social and political problem. So the asymmetric division of reproductive labor. Nina Power, for instance, in her contribution to the edited volume that I mentioned, The Adventures of the Dialectic of Sex, attributes Firestone a naive technological determinism, which would be coupled also with a biological determinism. Biological reproduction would be for Firestone what determines women's oppression, and technology the only thing that can undo it. And indeed, the way Firestone inscribes women's liberation in a historical dialectic that proceeds somehow from natural dependence to automation and liberation seems to speak in favor of such an assessment that sees her view of liberation as somehow determined technologically, and oppression is biologically determined. But I propose that in a way, once we somehow focus upon the specific political function that Firestone accords to ex utero gestation, but also the philosophical sources through which she puts forth her specific anti-naturalist stance, I propose, and also she articulates a specific, let's say, what we could see as a kind of re-articulation or rethinking of the classic philosophical division between physis and nomos. So when we consider this, I think that, let's say, a different picture of Firestone's understanding of biology and technology comes out. So Firestone's book is dedicated to Simone de Beauvoir. And although Firestone is really critical of Beauvoir's existentialist Hegelian framework of a struggle of consciousnesses, some of the arguments presented in the dialectic, I think, remain significantly indebted to the second sex. In the second part of the second sex, called Lived Experience, Beauvoir analyzes the typical social roles women encounter as they go through life and how relations of power shape them, thus somehow grounding what or prefiguring what some call critical phenomenology. The chapter called The Mother, where she analyzes women's different attitudes towards pregnancy, birth, giving, maternity, and so on, begins importantly with a quite lengthy discussion of abortion, in which Beauvoir outlines the devastating impact upon women's and children's health and well-being that illegal backyard abortions have, and the vast class differences in access to appropriate care. And she makes a strong case in favor of legal and accessible abortion as the necessary but not sufficient condition for what she calls free chosen motherhood. Other conditions would be women's economic and existential independence, the socialization of childcare to some degree, and upending the gender division of labor. Analogously, I propose Firestone envisages ectogenesis and the automation of reproductive labor not as the sole solution to women's oppression, but a condition for truly free and equal parenting. Ectogenesis could function as an equalizer and allow all, regardless of biological givens, to enter into reproductive arrangements free of economic, ideological, or social pressure. And we can consider how this also speaks to some, let's say, demands for reproductive justice made by the transgender movement or non-heterosexual couples and so on. The availability of ectogenesis would then for Firestone have this kind of facilitating function. She makes clear that traditional in utero pregnancies would persist and they wouldn't be discouraged. Rather, kind of introducing the possibility of automating biological reproduction is more of a way for equalizing the way people can become parents without pressure and coercion. But more than the specific picture of reproductive relation that Firestone paints, I think what is interesting is that she seems to be saying, as xenofeminists also, let's say after her, that if nature is unjust, we should change nature. And this brings me to the specific anti-naturalism which Firestone develops by explicitly drawing upon Beauvoir's The Second Sex. In the chapter Biological Data of the Second Sex, Beauvoir famously debunked the possibility of legitimizing women's secondary status with reference to biological givens. Where there might be biological differences between human beings, these for Beauvoir carry no meaning in themselves. Each society gives them the particular meaning according to the technological, economic, political, and cultural context in which these givens are taken up. On the other hand, Beauvoir also emphasizes that the body is one's window into the world. The world will appear different to us depending on what our bodies are and what their capacities, abilities, or disabilities are. Furthermore, in the chapter, in the part History, Beauvoir attempts to explain how did this all begin, how women's oppression came about, and according to her reading of Hegel's master-slave dialectic via Kojève, human consciousness and subjectivity would be formed by othering others. But all subjects would somehow try to reciprocally other others, thus entering into struggles for recognition, which could end in reciprocity and mutual recognition. If this has not happened for women, for Beauvoir, it is because of women's reproductive capacities. This would have tied them to giving life, an activity that would not be as socially valued as shaping life or taking it, but also it would tie women to material dependencies, existential dependencies upon men, preventing them from entering struggles for recognition. Readers of Beauvoir have found it, of course, hard to reconcile these facets of her treatment of biology and have argued that in History, she regrettably slides into biologically determinist explanations. Here, I think that the distinction between empirical cause and metaphysical reason that Stella Sanford makes in her article for the volume Further Adventures of the Dialectic of Sex becomes quite useful. And I think what she writes about Firestone in relation to this distinction is equally valid for Beauvoir. So just because they consider an empirical given, in this case human procreation, to have contributed to establishing women's oppression, it doesn't mean they must consider it a metaphysical reason that would forever legitimize such oppression. And I argue that they also don't consider it as legitimizing it. According to Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir writes that, I quote, "Man is not a natural species, he is a historical idea," unquote. And this is what Firestone quotes from Beauvoir as well. She also argues that it is in the nature of human beings to make, so to speak, history. Who human beings are, the characteristics they appear to have, are the result of this history-making activity, which of course includes the technological externalization of their capacities as well. This understanding of biological givens, history-making, and technology enables one, I think, to bring together Beauvoir's seemingly contradictory accounts of the role of biological givens in women's oppression, and to see how they're taken up by Firestone, without that leading necessarily to a biological or technological determinism. What is natural, as Firestone writes, echoing Beauvoir, is not a human value, which is implicitly confirmed, if not explicitly endorsed, by everyone who opens an umbrella in the rain, takes antibiotics, or uses a smartphone, as Victoria Margret in her book on Firestone aptly points out. Naturalism, in this sociopolitical sense, that is the conviction that forms of oppression would be grounded in the natural biological otherness of oppressed groups, has functioned throughout history to ideologically legitimize very different relationships of oppression, as some French materialist feminists have, for instance, analyzed at length. And antinaturalism then would be key to existentialist philosophy, as French philosopher Michel Caille argues. As we have seen, we can find...
Sorry, 3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have seen that we can find a special brand of anti-naturalism in the work of Shulamit Firestone. And as I have pointed out, this is not a radical social constructivism that would reduce all natural facts to discourses. Natural givens such as dependencies and vulnerabilities inherent in human biological reproduction for Firestone as for Beauvoir do exist. The realist but non-determinist take on nature, however, is also far removed from the vitalist materialism of new materialist theories, for instance, which optimistically confide in the self-transforming capacity of matter to bring about social change. Lena Gunnarsson has argued that in such philosophies, one can find an overly optimistic and unrealistic faith in natural becoming as always working in favor of feminist endeavors. This is clearly not the case for her, and markedly so when it comes to reproduction. It is necessary to take biological givens into account and those systems of reproductive oppression, but rather than having faith in the inherent transformability of matter or the mutability of biological givens, we should rather think about how to substitute one social structure, the patriarchal nuclear family, for instance, for another, socialized childcare and degendered parenting arrangements. Referring to British philosopher of science Roy Pascal and his critical realism, Gunnarsson thus argues in favor of taking natural givens into account, whether we think about reproductive or environmental justice, but without considering them as containing in themselves the key to either oppression or liberation. An end to oppression rather lies in how we as a society take up those natural givens. As I have argued above, we can find such we could call it a critical realist attitude towards the biological givens of human reproduction in both Beauvoir and Firestone. This remains important today, I think, because it allows us to recognize this realm as a potential site of gendered oppression without considering this oppression either legitimate or necessarily everlasting. We can understand both Beauvoir's and Firestone's take on biological reproduction and its technological assistance or managing as positing a complex, non-linear and non-exclusive causality between biological reproduction and social oppression, according to which some biological givens have been taken up in specific social and cultural contexts to entrench systems of oppression, but by actively politically challenging those contexts, we can undo that nexus. I think I came to the end of my time now, so maybe I will conclude here. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for your really thorough reflection and presentation of Firestone's and also de Beauvoir's elaboration of these natural given, the reproduction of and giving birth, or however one wants to frame it, and what to do about it to end the suppression caused by it or related to it or made by others because of it. I liked very much how you explained these different possibilities. So please. And hello, back again at the technology session. And I want to introduce to you our next speaker. And it is Tatjana Kolomeitceva.
Yes,
and she's an independent researcher in Moscow, in Russia, but she got her PhD in the history of Russian philosophy in Yekaterinburg in Russia. And she will speak to us to the topic, user experience as enlightenment, UX for women philosophers presentation. And please, the floor is yours, Tatjana.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I start. The notion of user experience concerns a huge variety of different aspects of the interaction between the end user and the company. In my talk, I will concentrate on user experience in the digital world. I mean websites and apps. During the last 10 years, media anthropology has been examining the biases of digital world. It involved gender aspects in training the machines in artificial intelligence, unfair recruitment, not enough trained specialists who can't avoid prejudices. I would like to suggest a philosophical critique of user experience in digital world, and then make some practical notes on how the ideas of such a critique could improve the opportunities of women philosophers' presentation. First of all, I will develop some thoughts on the epistemological critique of user experience theory. Then I suggest the philosophical critique of user experience practice. The third part of my talk is dedicated to practical suggestions of better women philosophers' presentation in digital. I'm looking forward to feedback, but if we run out of time, it will be okay. Anyway, I will leave my email in the chat. Methodologically, I base my talk on Kant and Heidegger. Kant helps me to develop the epistemological critique of user experience. Heidegger allows to give some practical advices of women philosophers' presentation in digital. I use two of Kant, What is Enlightenment, and the treatise Logic of 1800, and I use the ideas of being and time by Heidegger. Kant's philosophy gives me the notion of enlightenment, which is supposed to be the independence of thinking freely, to use one's mind properly. I also appreciate Kant's analysis of why people tend to not use their own minds. I also use Heidegger's notion of being ready to hand, which allows me to think of websites and apps as tools. If a tool is being ready to hand, for Heidegger, we can speculate of humans using it in a way that is more than just the tool. For instance, the X gives us the information of our hand. We can hold the X. This example is given by Heidegger, so the websites and apps can tell a lot about people if what they are being ready to hand. So I use Kant and Heidegger, but my key goal is to show the importance of philosophical critique of user experience theory and practice. I find this methodology useful, but it's not ultimate, and I'm going to mention that one of Kant's passages could be criticized for the same reason for which I criticize user experience theory, and I'll show it. And if you can suggest another methodology, I will be very pleased to discuss it after my talk. So I come to the first part, the epistemological critique of user experience theory. The field of user experience theory is not so young, it's almost 10 years old. It spreads all over the world and tends to be a global phenomenon. There are user experience writing and design textbooks that postulate a unified approach to writing text and designing for websites and apps. So we can come to the situation when we have the unified approach of the interaction between digital and humans, and this approach is spreading globally. So what is the base of this approach? The base of user experience theory is Dawkins' theory of MEMS. The information must be packed well in order to go through the psychological bottleneck of attention. The MEMS that accomplish to the human nature will survive, others will die. The metaphor of MEM is, in my point of view, the metaphorical perception of the world in user experience theory. So we can develop some kind of Cartesian or Kantian algorithm of philosophical critique of particular websites and apps and the user experience theory on the whole. Fighting this metaphorical way of explaining everything is the project of enlightenment. As Kant said, sapere audi, be brave to use your own mind. The main goal of user experience theory is to provide the knowledge in the field of psychology and neuroscience in order to rule the human attention. All members of the website or an app must go through the psychological bottleneck of attention. Kant would say in this situation that people are like cattle who don't move without their nannies, and they forget their freedom, and they will be very careful and even suspicious if they are given their freedom to act. Enlightenment is the independence of thought, the independence of choice. Kant also speaks about laziness as one of the main reasons preventing people from thinking freely. The algorithms of user experience theory develop such laziness in human. So both Dawkins and Kant speculate of the experience of the borders of human mind. In the end of the first part of my talk, I'd like to speak about 4 questions from Kant's treatise Logic applying to user experience theory. The first question, what can I know? The base of user experience theory is psychology and neuroscience, appealing to Dawkins' theory of MEMS, as I have mentioned. On one hand, this can lead to a new stage of critique of psychology in a Husserlian way. On the other hand, user experience usage of MEM concept resembles the logic of expelling women from the history of philosophy. Now I'd like to give a quotation from one of the textbooks of user experience writing. A memo that never enters the brain, it doesn't exist. So if people don't know about women philosophers, their writing don't exist. By the way, we can criticize Kant for the similar passage, as I have mentioned. He speaks not about bottlenecks of attention, but about some kind of sieve, like sand or mesh sieve or screen or flower sifter. The best writings of the past went through this flower sifter, and we have only the best in present. That passage can be found in Kant's treatise Logic, as well as Kant's history of philosophy without women philosophers. The second question is, what must I do in digital world to suggest content, to design any writing in order to catch the attention of public? The third question, what may I help? User experience theory proposes its own pragmatic teleology with setting the main marketing goal and cutting any practice that would not be appropriate for psychological bottlenecks. The fourth question, what is a man? Here we have a concept of human nature in digital. Again, the quotation from the textbook. The MEMS that are optimized for receptivity will go on to dominate, while those that are misaligned with human nature will be selected against and ultimately go extinct, suffering the silent, ignored death of most digital inventions. Nice. Can we say that we don't know much about women philosophers' writings because they don't fit the human nature? It resembles of how it used to be in medical sciences before the 19th century. No experiments on rats, no chemistry, but huge belief in human nature. You don't survive, well, your case is against human nature. Here we also can notice the metaphorical way of thinking. this notion of human nature. And of course, there would be more metaphors. The human is suggested to be a user of buttons and words. The quote from user experience textbook: "We are cognitive misers," meaning that we will allocate the least possible processing power to determine our value to us. Now, from user experience theory critique, I would like to come to the critique of user experience practice critique. User experience aims at gadgets to become the main tools of humans. We can use Heidegger's concept of being ready to hand here. If there are buttons on gadgets, so our hand can press them. User experience specialists do their best to design and write the websites and apps in order to fit psychological peculiarities of a person. User experience aims to make websites and apps being ready to hand in this way. When we look at the website, we can find the buttons with sayings subscribe or buy now. It gives us knowledge that human hand can press this button and the human mind can leave such things without asking, without questioning himself. For instance, have I freedom to do anything else here? Have I space to think about anything else here? All these things are in imperative mood, which implies to follow the instructions. No discussions. And these instructions result me of what Dorota Dutch mentioned as a keynote on our conference about the quotes in Beth in ancient Greece. They are perfectly repeated and remembered. And nowadays, we write them on the buttons on websites and apps. And people become the creatures pressing the buttons on websites where they don't have room to question the whole process. But what if we had not these sayings like share or subscribe, but share your opinion with us? I mean, not the inclinative mood, but questions. Women need the space where they can be not only passive consumers, but thinkers. It's hard to be a thinker on a website with the button with saying in this inclinative mood. This mood creates hierarchy. Hierarchy leads to women's expelling from the discourse. The websites and apps with buttons of questions would be being ready to hand too. But such websites and apps as being ready to hand would tell us that there is a room for discussion, for using our mind, and that all the people are subjects, including women. Women need room women need room to be treated like subjects, like thinkers in the digital world, not only consumers, but subjects who can give their opinion freely. To conclude of this critique of user experience practice, I would like to mention that all things in this mood, like subscribe, yes, or even share your opinion, are insufficient. We need room to answer questions. So what do you think of would be better instead than share your opinion? Then, and now I come to the last part of my talk, the practical suggestions of better women philosophers presentation in digital. I want to suggest that we could provide all the texts of women philosophers and about women philosophers with audio versions. Headphones are another very popular gadget that also can be named being ready to hand or being ready to ear. And with audio versions, these texts of women philosophers could become the resources of education for people leading active way of life, or, for example, going in for sports. In audio versions, such texts could be posted on websites with books as well as with music, iTunes, audiobooks, bookshops, and so on. That's my first suggestion. My second suggestion is to rethink the process of moderating web resources. Now, moderators are not so well paid and well trained. If we want the digital world to have the room for discussion, we should improve moderation of it. In this point, Kant's idea of enlightenment could be useful too. Kant speculates about who can manage the freedom of speech, how can we manage the freedom of speech and justice and peace in society. So I would say that in our case, the answer is good moderation and obeying the rules of moderation by all users. So to conclude it, I want to point out that our aim should be to rethink user experience and to create a new type of digital where women are creators of meanings and points, not only users. So, what do you think of such ideas?
Thank you very much. Great thoughts. Thank you for your presentation. And thanks for taking up this concept of user experience in a way I have not heard it. I love it. All right, so I'm happy to present our next speaker. And this is William Parkurst from the University of South Florida in the USA. And he will speak to the topic, transcribing minorities and philosophy, archival transcription in the digital age. And I'm very curious what you will present us, maybe even a practical example. Please, William, do you want to share your screen and show us something, or do you have a talk without slides?
Yeah, I would like to share some slides, if that's okay.
Yeah, I guess you should be able to do so.
Okay.
Yes, it works. Great.
Okay, awesome. Here we go.
Looks good.
Okay.
And
so hi.
I can hear you at least, so the floor is yours.
All right. Well, hi, I'm Will Parkurst. I just recently got my PhD at the University of South Florida. I'm now an archival fellow over at the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. So I end up working with a lot of archival evidence and thinking about how archival evidence should play into how we understand philosophers, right? So my published work does like indexes of Schopenhauer's sources on mathematics. I'm also doing stuff on describing and writing commentaries on all Nietzsche's annotations in his personal library. So things like that within the continental tradition. But pedagogically, I'm very invested in the sort of feminist project, and all my courses include a lot of feminist content. And one of the things I talk to my students about is that the history of philosophy has systematically, for both personal and non-personal reasons, excluded women and minorities throughout its whole history. And so when we teach, when we try to decolonialize our syllabi, we are in some sense doing something radical. But I don't think that's enough, really, if we're going to push this forward, if we're going to take a more intersectional approach to how this next century in philosophy is going to work and look. And one of the things that I think is most important, at least from my perspective, since I work with archival documents a lot, is that historically we've just systematically not provided women and minorities of all different backgrounds with the actual textual resources and digital resources to do and compete in high quality archival scholarly history. Right. So with Nietzsche, for example, we have every single one of his letters basically transcribed, every one of his published works, pretty much everything he ever wrote that's unpublished. So that's all available online. You can search it all. All the scans of all of it is available online. But when we look at minorities in philosophy, we don't have that sort of access. So this project, Transcribing Minorities in Philosophy, was a project to integrate my pedagogy and work with other instructors and scholars, try to get more access to digital works. So here's the basic idea. The basic idea is to integrate archival transcription of minority philosophers into coursework through crowdsourced online digital platforms. Right? And that sounds like a jumble of words if you're not used to it. So what is archival transcription exactly? For archival transcription, an archive uploads a high quality scan, and then through these digital platforms, people individually, volunteers, manually transcribe it into text, right? Text that is computer readable, right? So these archival documents, this is, for example, something from Mary Church Terrell, who I'll be talking about a little more in a bit, but she was an early intersectional Black feminist in the US, but we don't talk about her at all in philosophy classes, and only rarely when you talk about Black feminism. So one of the things that archival transcription does, which I think is really important, is that it makes them digitally visible to scholars, right? So it's not just out there on a server somewhere where you can't see it, right? It's not just in a file that you can access on the internet, but right, once it's transcribed, right, we could say, search this transcription, and it will pop up in Google. Right, as my students will tell me, and your students might also, right, anything that's not Googleable doesn't exist, right? So in the age of Google, any sort of archival work that's not transcribed is visible. It's erased. It's a form of digital erasure and violence. It's perpetuating a system of violence and oppression already in place. So that's what archival transcription is. And what I'm suggesting is that we bring this in to coursework through this project. So my hope for this conference and this presentation basically is to just make more context from international approach. And my own training in feminism is just from the US, which if at any standpoint of epistemology, you know that, right, our perspectives are always partial, and certainly coming from the US, that is a very partial perspective. So hoping to get some context through this for people who might be interested in doing this work in their classroom. So let's talk just a little bit about this project. So for the past couple of years, I've actually been integrating archival transcription into my own pedagogy, right? Where we talk about the history of feminism, for example. And the students really love it because not only are they learning, right, about these great minority figures in philosophy, but they're also learning, right, why and how these sort of canons were suppressed. And not only that, they get to do something even better, which is work to sort of fix the problem on a systemic level. So actually contribute to a solution, which is pretty great for them. They really enjoy that. Many of my ethics classes previously, they'd be like, there's all these problems. The world is so, unfair and unjust, and it just seems like oppression all around us. What can we actually do? So here's something, practical, real that we can do that can actually make history more visible and make minorities and women in history more visible. So I've been doing that for several years in my own classes, and I wanted to make this a little larger, this idea into a bigger project. So on the encouragement of some of my colleagues that thought this was a good idea, I negotiated with some archives and actually got the first of its kind certificate and archival transcription set up for instructors, right, free of charge. So they take this sort of seminar and get the certificate. The certificate is officiated by the U.S. National Archives and the State Archives of North Carolina, right? So it's actually official. In 2021, taking this project a little bit larger onto a national scale, I ended up getting a founding grant from Hypatia, a feminist journal of philosophy. And what that's going to do is allow us to build a website, set up some small fellowships, and we're going to start with working on some of the archival remains of early intersectional Black feminists, Mary Church Terrell, Maria Stewart, Sojourner Truth, and their archival records. So, sort of idea behind this project is to make it explicitly intersectional, right? So, a lot of the work on reconstituting or reforming the canon of philosophy, at least that I've seen over in the US, there is a really big push for white women to come into the canon, but it's not as strong for other intersectional identities. So for people with disabilities, for people of different citizenship status, for people of different gender identities. So I'm hoping to have this project be explicitly intersectional and try to address some of those gaps. But so let's talk a little bit about how this project is working. So the idea here is that transcribing minorities and philosophy will create assignments that you can just import into your courses, right? So in my own courses, I've done 3 different kinds. We're, of course, open to other ideas. But write extra credit assignments that are just sort of standalones. So you can just assign it to a student. They'll do a little bit of reading, do some transcription on that philosopher. Also have single in-class assignments. So if you just want to spend one class on a particular philosopher, on a particular women or minority in the history of philosophy, we'll have those available, as well as whole course sections. So, right, these will be free to use. You're welcome to download it, change it however you want. But the idea is to make it easy so that instructors can include this work in their courses. So let's just take an example. This is one that I've used in my courses, and others have used my approach to teaching it. And I'm happy to say that the online crowdsourced platform that we used, which was the By the People project from the Library of Congress, has transcribed almost all of their archival materials. I think there's 2 or 3 pages left. So this approach does seem to work pretty well. It's gaining traction in a lot of different ways. So this is sort of a rundown of like one example of how I integrate archival transcription into my courses. So in her autobiography, Mary Church Terrell talks about her experience with first wave feminists, right? And specifically, she was invited to a conference and was explicitly asked, while previously she has talked as a Black woman about feminism. She was explicitly told, if you're going to be at this conference, you have to talk without regard to race, right? So they're explicitly silencing a sort of intersectional approach. So with that, we then looked at, or had the students do some reading of one of her speeches, right, where she addresses the sort of intersectional nature of Black women's identity, right? And this is back, 100 years ago. The sort of narrative that we have that intersectionality certainly coined in the late 80s, early 90s, but the ideas of intersectionality go back a long, long way. So once we get done with some of that reading, then the students are like, wow, she has lots of interesting and cool ideas, lots of really progressive feminist ideas. Then we actually have the students transcribe work. So some work that they transcribe is typed out drafts like this. And if the students are feeling more adventurous, right, they can actually transcribe handwritten documents. So I've done this in a variety of different formats, right? Have the students do their transcription all on their own. I've had them do it in groups, which can be helpful. I've also done in-class transcriptions. It can be really fun. So basically, the way this project is being framed is that there's 3 sort of partners that have to function in tandem, right? So there's early career scholars and all but dissertation candidates, right, that will be helping to form the assignments themselves, right, as well as the identifying previously ignored philosophers, as well as working with established scholars who have a much greater background in which philosophers have been unjustly ignored. And once those are established, right, the instructors can then implement these sort of assignments. And of course, the students get to actually transcribe it. And from a pedagogical perspective, right, working with archival documents is a good and interesting thing to be able to do, right? It's a good technical skill set. But also, it's the gold standard of education. To actually work with primary source documents is the sort of the best education you can get. In addition, we have to work with archives, which I have a lot of experience with, and librarians finding collections and having them upload them so they can be transcribed. And last, importantly, also working with communities, right? A lot of minority documents are particularly sensitive. So there's been a variety of archival protocols, right? Such as the Colored People Project. There's also protocols for handling Native American documents, because the history of working on archival documents has just been really oppressive and violent. So making sure that communities and community leaders have input and are at the table ends up being really important to these sort of projects. So this will be my last slide. I guess I'll end a little early and hopefully we can have a discussion about this. But looking forward into 2020 or 2021, sorry, I know what year it is. COVID just sucked a year of my life away. So in 2021, we're hoping to get a website up that will have a variety of resources that will have the assignments that I talked about that you can just add as extra credit and have your students actually contribute to structural change within philosophy. We'll also have links to a variety of these online crowdsourced platforms, right? Not specific to philosophy, but there's a lot of them cropping up because archives are finding it's a great way to make this history visible again, specifically along social justice lines. So in particular, through 2021, we're hoping to get assignments on Maria Stewart, Sojourner Truth, and Mary Church Terrell, all of whom are early intersectional Black feminists from the US. So after that, we're working on putting together a committee to assess new projects. And we will also try to offer another training session for certificates in archival transcription for instructors who want to implement this sort of technique. And we're also going to be offering small fellowships for philosophy ABD candidates and early career scholars, right? There's not a whole lot of money at this point, but I think doing this type of work, right, having read some of the work of like Eve Tuck and their work on decolonialization, it's not actually a metaphor, right? If you're not actually changing the material conditions of people's lives, you're just sort of allowing for the curious eye of the oppressor to observe history without actually, addressing the actual oppression that's happening today. So trying to actually support candidates that are doing work on minority philosophers. So that ends my presentation. I'd love some feedback if you have any thoughts, in particular, how this project might move to a more international audience, right? Here, at least in the US, right? All the instructors that we currently have involved in the project all teach in English, right? So that's a constraint of the project currently. But certainly there's lots of really important minority philosophers whose archival documents are not in English. And that might be an opportunity to bring this into other countries and other educational institutions. So that concludes my presentation. Hopefully we can talk about it a little bit. I'd love to have ideas. Feel free to contact me. I'll post it in the chat here. But if you want to give me feedback, you're welcome to email me. Or there's an email list where I'm emailing out updates about the project. Which philosophers should we think about focusing on as we move forward? So yeah. Overall, I'm really excited about the project. It's very rare that students get to work on primary source material and also actually address systemic oppression in a way that actually might make a difference in a scholar's life. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation of your very special project. I'm sorry.